In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory to Jesus Christ. Glory forever. So today, Orthodoxy 101 is moving away from, shall we say, more theological, liturgical sort of items. And we're going to start to move into more personal items in the sense of what it is that we as Christians are responsible to do. And so this class is going to be focused on stewardship. Stewardship. So, what it is that we are as stewards. And this is always something that a lot of clergy are always very cautious to talk about because they don't want to be perceived as oh, there's the priest always talking about money, that type of thing. And in fact, stewardship is not just about money, though this is kind of a heart of a matter, heart of a discussion, and we'll get into that as the class unfolds. But it's not a subject that we should shy away from, and we should be able to talk honestly about money. And in a couple of classes down the road, you're going to see how that is integral in what we do as a parish. But nonetheless, Christ himself was not shy to talk about money. In fact, it's probably the most talked about item in the Gospels. In fact, um, 25% of the Gospels stories talks about money or wealth and how to use it. There are 2,300 passages in the Bible about money. Think about that. 2,300 passages about that, and 11 of the 39 parables that Christ tells. And when I always remind people in the parish, when Christ says a parable, and he's particularly when he says the kingdom of God is like, then that's something we should be paying attention to because he's making a very important point. So 11 of the 39 parables are about money and wealth. Think about that. So it's certainly not something he shied away from talking, and it's certainly something that we should not. So why are we talking so much about money? Well, I think the way to start is a very simple passage. It's one that I put in every bulletin that I put out as a reminder, and that's Matthew 6:21. And what does it say in Matthew 6:21? Where your heart is, also will be your treasure. Think about that. Where your heart is also where your treasure will be. In other words, you put your money where your mouth is, right? But more importantly, it shows where you are in your life, what you're thinking, what are your priorities. And the most simplistic of those is the use of your money. And so ultimately, when we start speaking about money, about wealth, and more importantly, stewardship, we're going to define that in a bit, um, it's ultimately about spirituality. It's about your spiritual life. And we should not see this as any way other than that. That what we are talking about is a spiritual exercise that is no different than prayer or fasting or any of those things. It's more important for us to speak about these. In fact, when the three kind of roots of being a Christian, prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, are critical for us in understanding and living a life as a Christian. And so we need to look at those, and we've already talked about prayer and fasting, so it makes sense that now we talk about almsgiving or stewardship. So let's look at the word stewardship first and foremost, because that's a word that's thrown out a lot. Go on the internet, you will find uncountable numbers of websites dedicated to this concept of stewardship, more specifically dedicated to the concept of Christian stewardship. And it becomes so much so that you have to kind of wade through it and you kind of roll your eyes. And now there's some good elements in there. But ultimately, we have to look at this idea. The word steward actually comes from the Greek word economos, economos. And hence we have the word economy, right? Comes from that same word. Um, ecumenical comes from that same word. And what is it? What is an economos? An economos is an overseer or caretaker. In the Greek world, in the Roman world, in the early, the economos was someone who had the responsibility of taking care of a household. He was the steward of the household. And the steward held a great deal of power. He took care of the money, he took care of the running of the household, he had to make sure the operations of the household was done well. In fact, even that idea of the bishop, the episcopos, came from that sort of idea too. And so he had to be a responsible person and he had to be a trustworthy person because the master of the household was giving kind of all his treasure, all his life, all his livelihood, all his most precious things to the responsibility of the economos. And so he had a tremendous power, he had tremendous influence, and he decided how all the stuff was going to be used. He decided how the money was to be spent and how the resources were going to be utilized and even how the staff was going to be used. And so it was an important position. So when we talk about the steward or the economos, it's incredibly important. But here's the key: the economos was not just about the money; it was about all things in the household. So it was how things were used, how to direct those resources, who was best positioned to use their talents and gifts. And the economos, in the ideal sense, was the person in best position to make that decision, but he also strived to use it to the best of his ability and therefore to make his master happy. Because, by the way, if the economos did not exercise his authority correctly and properly, did not utilize the resources that were entrusted to him properly and correctly, there was painful and severe punishment that was laid upon him. You know, he who is given great power has great responsibility. And so, therefore, his responsibility was huge. And so, a lot of people looked to him. And so, the economos, the steward, is the person in that best position. All of us are stewards. All of us are given that responsibility. And we are given that responsibility to make sure that we use our time and our talents and our treasure to the best of our ability. We are all given the responsibility to take care of that what was entrusted to us, literally our life, which comes from God, but to recognize that all things come from God and is returned to God, that we're just stewards of it. We're just the economos of that which God gives us, no matter what it is. In fact, the entire creation. And so we have to be prepared in order to discuss this and to properly use this. And so commonly, and by the way, a very good book. It was written, and I know our Metropolitan Council is the first and the finest, which was a wonderful review on all this idea of stewardship and sacrificial offerings. But anyway, so very often we couch this in three ways. We say, how are we going to use our time? How are we going to use our talent? And how are we going to use our treasure that has been entrusted to us? So think about this. What is the best use of our time? How are we giving our time to God? How are we giving it to others? How are we using this limited time that we have on earth to build up the church, to build up our own spiritual lives, to make ourselves grow in the image of God and in the likeness of God? So our time is a valuable commodity. We know that, right? I mean, when I worked down in the business sector, you know, every hour was billable. Every your time was money. You know, anybody who's a lawyer or a doctor or all that stuff, you know, those billable hours. Well, our life is a billable hour. Our life is something in which we have to give and we have to utilize properly. How do we use the talent? You know, all that we get is from God, and different people have different talents, and we have to use them for the glory of God. As I said in the parish, and you know, if our talent is to scrub the floor of the church, then we do it for the glory of God and we offer it to God. If our talent is singing, we use that for the glory of God. If our talent is organization, or is it preaching, or is it kindness, or is it whatever it may be, all the good things that we hear the Apostle Paul talking about what it means to be a good Christian, all of us have those talents. And we have to take those talents and give them to God. We can't hide them like a light under a bushel. We have to give them out and give them to God. Again, to waste that is to waste our life. To waste that which God has given us is to waste a possibility of something. And then finally, and I notice this is the third thing, is our treasure. How are we using our treasure to glorify God? How are we using it to build up the church? How are we using it? All that is and is illusory. All that money will disappear. It will go. It will. We argue more about money than anything else, and we have to really take a good and serious look at it and say, how am I using that which God has given me? And some people have an abundance of treasure. We hear that often in the gospel. And then some people have very little treasure. And we hear that often in the gospel. And it's not the question of whether you have a lot or a little, it's what are you doing with it? How are you using it? Because again, going back to that original quote from Matthew, where our heart is, there also will be our treasure. And so this is an important thing for all of us to remember. We must always think of terms of being a steward. God gives us each gifts of time, talent, and treasure to be used responsibly, properly, appropriately. And the reason that Christ talks so much about this is that any of these three things are misused or misdirected. Every one of us is probably guilty of that in one way or another. And so we have to really say, okay, then what is it that I'm doing? And it requires a certain level of introspection. And that's why prayer and fasting and all this stuff goes together, because it requires us to really look at ourselves and really think about who we are and what we're trying to do. And so when we're using it for questionable ends, we have to have real questions about what it is. So everything we have comes from God. We hear that all the time. Everything comes from God. And our vocation as a Christian is to return it. Everything we have comes from God. And we as a Christian are there to return it to God. And the church fathers write consistently about this. We are a sacrificial being. We are a people that were created to return love to God, to return everything to God. And so that is incredibly important. In the divine liturgy, during the anaphora, when we're consecrating the gifts, there's a point right before the consecration of the gifts when the priest lifts up the chalice and the paten that contains the wine and the bread that will become the body and blood of Christ. And he lifts it up, he does it in a particular way with his hands crossed, and he says, "Thine own of thine own, we offer unto thee on behalf of all and for all." And I would probably say if anything defines us as a Christian, or even that liturgical act, it's those lines. Thine own of thine own, we offer unto thee on behalf of all and for all. Because what are we saying there? This is yours. You gave it to us, and now we're returning it to you in a proper way to glorify you. And we're doing it not just on our behalf, but all those who are gathered here. And that's why it's so important. It's like the perfect and succinct definition of what a Christian should be, offering back to God his, which he gave to us on behalf of all. And so we are told then to do that in our life, not just in that liturgical act, but in our entire life. St. Paul says in 1 Peter 4:10, he tells us to be good stewards of God's grace. I'm just giving you some examples there. St. Ignatius of Antioch, one of the earliest Christian writers who predated putting the Bible together, wrote in a letter to Polycarp, who was, again, one of the first Christians and the first Christian martyr, tells us to be stewards in God's house, members of his household, and his servants. So even back then, even at that very earliest times as the nascent church was being put together, we were already being exhorted to be stewards, to be economoses, to offer to God everything that we had. In fact, the whole idea of the deacon, diakonos, to serve, one of the deacons' primary roles in the early church was to go and gather those offerings on behalf of the church and then to make sure that they were given appropriately out, like to help the widows and the poor and all those sort of people. So he was that was one of his primary responsibilities, to go and serve the community. Um, so what does it mean to be a good steward? It's not just, as we discussed, it's not just limited to money. We also have to be stewards of all of God's creation. And this is a theme that you'll see coming up now with a lot of modern Orthodox writers, is talking about how are we to be stewards of God's creation. In other words, take care of the world that he has given us. And sometimes we don't. We pollute it, we abuse it, we ignore it, we do all sorts of things. But yet all of that creation was given to us, even from that earliest uh, Genesis story where God gives us command over all of creation in order to use it well. And of course, we fail. We failed right from the beginning, and the rest of time has been spent trying to make up for that failure. So we have to do that. We have to take care of all creation. We have to take care of the church, each other, those that God places in our life. In fact, all of God's creation. We are stewards on this earth and must use it responsibly and for the glory of God. We do not own it, we simply care for it. And so that's what we have to do when we start thinking about this. And so, how we care for it is precisely why it is a spiritual issue. When we care for something, we don't do it for our selfish needs, right? We don't want to abuse it. We don't want it to be destroyed. We don't want it to hurt us. We want to care for something. And so we have to do it in a good and proper way. And we do it on behalf of others, right? And hence, economos, steward, because it's entrusted to us to use it wisely and appropriately. We return it because it's not ours, it's God's. And now we should keep, nor should we keep it to ourselves. And that's the ultimate selfishness that we have, is that we see all this stuff as mine. I worked hard, I got this, and that's all good and proper and true. You may have worked hard and you may have done all that stuff and you may have built it up. That's not the question. The question is, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to use it? Because if you hide it, like we just heard in the recent parable of the talents, right? The person who had 5 talents used it wisely and returned it, and the person who had 2 talents used it wisely and returned it. But the one who hid it was, as the gospel parable says, was cast out into the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth, whatever that imagery may be. But that's because he did not use it wisely. He did not return it to his master. He kept it to himself. And that selfishness, again, is really kind of like that ultimate and original sin, that we look to ourselves rather than to God. So what is it then? We are, as Christians, are called then to shine with the light, so let your light shine before men so they may see your good works and rejoice. And so when we have this wonderful gift and we return it and we use it properly, we choose it appropriately, we are then shining with the light. And time after time after time again, in the stories of the saints, particularly those who were born wealthy or privileged, you find time and time and time again that they take that and they give it away, or they use it for the glory of God in a good and appropriate way. And you just have to look up people like St. Anthony of the Desert or St. Nicholas of Myre and Lycia, or any of these saints. They used it for the glory of God. They gave up all the earthly treasures, as one of the church fathers says, so they can build up treasure in heaven. And so give up your time, give up your talent, give some of your treasure. So this is a kind of, we'll turn to a kind of a more practical question. And I get this question asked to me all the time, particularly among people who are catechumens, who have, and well, what do I do? How do I determine how much I should give? How much of my time, my talent, my treasure? How do I make this decision? And my answer is always the same: I can't tell you. And I usually get them all frustrated, but I can't tell you, because I can't tell you what to do in your heart. You have to make that decision within your own heart. You need to pray on it. You need to exercise it. You need to discuss it. You need to find that place where you think that you can make that difference, where you feel comfortable with that, and then increase it from there. Again, if I tell you to do something as a priest, and I tell you to give a certain amount or whatever it may be, then it no longer becomes a spiritual exercise. It doesn't no longer becomes a spiritual discipline. It becomes the priest asking for money. But if you come through that voluntarily through your own heart, then you'll find that something deeper will open within you. And again, we never take this apart. It's whether it's treasure, whether it's your talents, or whether it's your time. You have to find that place. And you have to go on that journey. You have to discover that. Search your heart, pray, give what you think. Um, and it's interesting too, because I was thinking about this the other day. Some of the best givers I've ever seen in my parishes over the years were the ones who had the least. And that I always found that interesting. People like the widows mite, that little bit amount that they had, they gave, and they gave with joy and thanksgiving and gratitude. And I always found that fascinating that they were the ones who always were the first in the line to give of whatever time, talent, or treasure. And the ones who may had an abundance of any of these sometimes were the more reluctant. And again, that's because it came down to a spiritual issue. They understood what it meant to give sacrificially, where the other people learned how to just give what was left over. And we don't ever want to be that. And I think if you read Luke 21, 1 to 14, 1 to 4, or Matthew 21, 41 to 44, you'll see this kind of brought out over and over again. So, how should we give? That's the question. And so I want to go through some key points and for us to kind of chew on and think about and to pray on. And the first and foremost thing you should do when you're thinking about this is what we call the first fruits. What do we mean by first fruits? Think throughout the Old Testament, there was actually periods of time of celebration in which the first fruits were offered. In other words, the first things that came out of the ground were first given to God, not the stuff that was left over after it was done. And we have to use that. We have to think not which was left over, but before you even begin, you give. We give to God first. Jewish law is very clear about this, by the way. It talks about that idea of first fruits. And then even liturgically, we do that. In August, on August 6th, we have the Feast of the Transfiguration. And at that feast, we celebrate the blessing of the fruit. Why are we doing it at that particular day? Because that's when the harvest is starting to come in. And so before the harvest is even brought out, I mean, this was historically, now it's much different, but the first fruits were offered to God in the church. And so we need to do that. And actually, that prayer at Transfiguration, when we do the blessing of the fruit, is actually called the prayer of the blessing of the first fruits. That's exactly what it's called. So it's embedded in our thought. The harvest has come in, and it's time to offer the first to God. So the first thing you need to do is not offer what's left over, but offer before you even begin. And very often, we look, well, how much time do I have left over this week? I'll give that to God. Or how much money do I have left over after paying all my bills? I'll give that to God. Or, how much time do I have available to do something? We can justify it in any way we want, but it should not be that way. Before we even begin, we give. And I'll guarantee you, and I can't quantify this other than I've seen it time and time and time again, that when people think in that way, their generosity is always rewarded. Not in some sort of prosperity gospel sort of way. That's silliness, but in a way that's really tangible to their spiritual life. That they increase in how they understand God. All the other stuff is illusory anyway. So the first thing we do is we give the first fruits. The next thing we do is we have to give regularly. Why? Because it's a discipline. Just like we pray regularly and we fast regularly. It's because it gives us a discipline on how to live our life. And we know that we have this regular sort of way in which we do it, however that may be, weekly, monthly, yearly, doesn't matter. Just that it's done on a regular basis. Um, you decide what that is, but stick to that discipline. Again, that's why it's a spiritual issue. Um, you are not required. Oh, okay, yeah. So I lost my train of thought. So you must discipline yourself to give on that regular basis, whatever that regular basis may be. The third thing is we have to give freely. Freely. We can't be compelled to give. If we're compelled to give, it's not really giving. It's not really a spiritual issue. It's just a tax. And if we have a tax, none of us want to pay taxes, right? We all grumble when we have to pay our taxes. That's not what it's about. It's not a tax, it's not a dues. It's something that's given freely. Matthew 10:5-8, and the healing of lepers is an important point, right? There 10 lepers that came, and God gave them the gift of healing. 9 of them went their way, and only 1 of them turned back and gave thanks to God. 10%. That's it. And so we have to really think about that then, what it is that we're doing. Why are we not giving thanks to God? And that's why it has to be a free will gift. It has to be something that you are required to do, but it's something that you want to do. Again, recognize that all that we have is from God and it should be returned to God. The next point is an important one and one that we overlook. We have to give joyfully. Joyfully. We have to be thankful that we're doing this, that we have to be glad that God has given us this opportunity to give of our time and our talent and our treasure. We need to be joyful, not grumbling. Oh, here comes a collection plate, or oh, I got to go mow the lawn at the church, or whatever it may be. We should want to do that. We want to be joyful in all that we want. Who wants to be grumpy about all this? We got enough grumpiness in the world. But be joyful that God has given you that opportunity to give of yourself, that He's opened that door for you, and that something that you do has an effect not only on yourself, but on someone else. Sometimes a huge effect that you'll never see. And yet somehow that joyfulness comes out there. I remember, this is a little bit of an aside, when I was a priest in Las Vegas, and there was a family here and Russian family, and they were going through their difficult times, and particularly the teenage son was just having a hard time. I mean, it's not a good place to raise teenagers at times. And eventually, I spent time. I talked to him. We had many discussions. I came in the altar. He learned how to be an altar server. He really liked doing that. And eventually, things sort of calmed down. And then they moved back to Russia. Hadn't heard from him in years and years and years, except on Facebook. He kept in touch with me. And I was on a trip to Moscow with the Metropolitan on the official delegation, and he heard I was coming. And he was so thrilled. And he wanted to know where I was going to be because he wanted me to see me again, and he wanted to introduce me to his daughter. And it was a beautiful moment, and we met up after the service, and he was teary, and he said, "You don't know what you did. You don't know how much you helped me in a difficult time in my life, and you gave me direction, and you showed God, and you pointed me in a way." And it affected me, and I came back. In fact, I now study. I studied iconography. He runs a museum of icons. He found a beautiful woman. They have a beautiful child, and he said, "I just wanted to say thank you." I had no idea. I was just being, a priest in my community and helping those people around me. You don't always get these sort of things coming back to you as a priest, but when you do, you get really thankful and humbled by it. So again, you don't know what that little thing can do to shift someone in their life. And each of us have that power, that extra little bit of money in the plate, or that extra kindness to that particular person, or that little bit of extra thing that you may do around the church. All of that has a huge effect. And we have to remember that. Because if we don't, again, we hide our light under a bushel. So, so be thankful, right? Uh, Apostle Paul states in 2 Corinthians 9:7. I always like to do this. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. Whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, as I said, for God loves a cheerful giver. God loves a cheerful giver. Can't be any more clear than that, right? So be thankful and full of joy when you give. The next one is sacrifice. The giving must be sacrificial. This is a hard one for sometimes for us to kind of get our head around because um, no one wants to sacrifice, right? We want to be comfortable. We want to be in our place. We worked hard to get to a point in where we are. And so when someone is saying, well, you need to sacrifice, and we get heard all the time, right? Especially now during this particular time, you need to sacrifice and all that for the good. We need to do sacrifice. In other words, we need to, when we give, again, whether it's time, talent, or treasure, we have to feel it. You know, again, we not just the first fruits, but we should feel it. We know that somehow we're sacrificing something. Isn't that the ultimate point? That's why in the temple in the Old Testament, they came to the temple and they sacrificed the the, the lamb or the dove or whatever they could afford. It was the best, and it from their flock. It was not something that was just sort of going to die anyway. They took their very best. And that's a big sacrifice because that's, in a sense, money out of your pocket, right? And you're taking a lamb that, you know, a lamb without blemish is technically what it's supposed to be. That's a lot of money, especially the wool and the hide and all that other sort of stuff. Yet that's what's offered to God. So you have to sacrifice. And Apostle Paul again says in 2 Corinthians 8, just look at this passage. And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace of God that's given to the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. Think about that. Their overflowing joy and extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. In other words, they were supporting other churches. For I testify they gave as much as they were able, even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded us for the privilege of sharing in the service to the Lord's people. Think about that. The privilege of sharing in the service to the Lord's people. And they exceeded our expectations. They gave themselves first of all to the Lord, and then by the will of God also to us. That's sacrificial giving. And we see this time and time and time again. I remember a story, I saw this actually. It's not a story, I actually saw this. A particular donor to a particular institution was a very wealthy man. He had done amazing things in his life. He had built up a great reputation, a very powerful reputation, a lot of wealth. He was a godly man. And when the time came at this institution for him to give, he decided that he would give away most of his wealth. He said, God had been good to me. I built all this stuff up. I've been touched by the mission of this institution. I really believe in it. And it's time for me to sacrifice, to make it hurt. That's the words he used when he was addressing all of us. I had to make it hurt so that I noticed what I was giving. Wow. And he did it full of joy. He was thrilled with that opportunity to be able to give. And isn't that a wonderful way to think? Isn't that a wonderful way that he had been so blessed in his life? And he worked hard. He did. And if I told you the business we did, you would see what I mean. But boy, he also understood what it all came down to. He wasn't trying to buy his way into heaven. He really honestly felt the joy and the privilege of being able to give of himself. That says a lot. The next thing we have to do when we give is without expectation. Give, expect nothing in return. We don't give with conditions. I had a person that I dealt with in one of my parishes who was a wealthy man, and he was willing to help out the parish on a particular issue. But then he sat down in my office and he explained, well, if I give you this, then you have to do this, 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 and this. Which I said, I can't accept that gift. I can't accept it. You're giving me conditions, and some of them weren't, bad conditions or things that I morally wrong. But he was giving conditions on what his money would be used for. You can't do that. You have to give without condition and trust that God is going to use it properly, and the people around it are going to use it properly, appropriately, and responsibly. Luke 6:35. Love your enemies, do good and lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be the sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the unthankful and the evil. So what is he saying there? Give without any expectation of return. And we want to put limits on our gifts. We want to say, I want you to do this. If I do this, you'll do that. We do that with God too, right? If you do this, then I'll do that, right? If you heal me of this disease, I'm going to do that. And sometimes those are unrealistic or selfish reasons. Give me $1 million, I'll give 10%, but let me win the lotto, and I'll give half of it to the church. Of course, you're not going to win when you think like that. You have to give and just trust that God's going to do what is right. That's the ultimate kind of leap in a way, especially people who are businessmen or other sort of things, because they're used to being able to, have all this in line and, do this, and you got a budget, and you got all these other sort of things, but they're missing the point. This is not a business, it's a church. So those basic points. Let's go. First fruits. Give regularly, give freely, give joyfully, give sacrificially, and give without expectations. There's 6 very important points on what we do. So finally, there's a 7th point, and this is the one that opens a lot of discussions, and it opens a lot of material, and books are written on this, and articles, and you will see this all over the internet. And that is the question of the tithe. What is the tithe? Well, technically speaking, the tithe literally means 10%, right? So it's 10%. In Israel, in the Old Testament, they were required to give the tithe. You give the tithe of not only of your goods, but you also give the tithe of your time and your tithe. It's all very much wrapped into a theological way of thinking. And the 10% is a number, in my opinion. It could be 1%, it could be 90%. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that you're thinking in terms of what percent do I give to God? In that case, you give 100%, right? But if you think about it, 10% is a good way to start. We should all strive in some way to give 10% of our income away. And that's not, taxes don't count. That's not before taxes or after taxes, or, if you're thinking that way, you're already missing the point. We should all strive that somehow 10%, however we choose to do it, should be given away. But you know what? I can't make that decision. Only you can make that decision. If 1% is something that's good for you, then do 1%. If 50% is good for you, then do 50%. Doesn't matter. It's picking a certain percentage as a discipline, as a way of kind of helping you, and then following through on that. And it also gives us a chance to really look at ourselves, right? Like, how much am I doing? How much of my time am I giving away? How much of my talent am I giving away? Is 10% too little to give? Probably. But it is, something for us to at least go there. Pick a percentage. Doesn't matter. But follow those other 6 points, and you'll see your heart opened on what we should do. But we have to always be careful, right? Because the tithe, as I talked about, is very biblical. Yet one of the passages that Christ really talks about this is in Matthew 23, which I always tell my seminarians, you should read this passage as often as you can, and because it really is directed at all of us. And he says, what does he say to the Pharisees? Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites. I love, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites. Those are the power people. For you tithe the mint and the dill and the cumin. In other words, all the spices that were important, you had to give a certain tithe to the church, to the temple. Yet you neglected the weightier matters of the law: justice, mercy, faithfulness. These you should have done without neglecting the others. In other words, the tithe that you're asking the people to do was not the end. It was just the means for you to understand what it means to be merciful, exercise justice, to be faithful to God. The tithe was just a way to get you to think in those terms. But you became so fixated on that tithe and that 10% of all these different things that you completely forgot what the whole point was. And that's why it's so important for us to understand that. So we need to understand that it can also be Pharisaic. It can also lead us away from God. When we start there and counting out our pennies and making sure that they're we get to a certain percentage or whatever it may be, then we're missing the point. Right? Then we become Pharisaic in it. Just as the clergy can become Pharisaic. You need this, you need that, you got to do this, you got to do that. And yet they're not doing it themselves. So that's very important. So Paul continues, by the way, in 2 Corinthians 8:10-12. And here is my judgment about what is best for you in this matter. Last year, you were the first not only to give, but also have the desire to do so. Now finish the work, so that your eager willingness to do it may be matched by your completion of it according to your means. For it is the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. What is Paul saying? You were great. You started off with great exuberance and you really helped and you gave beyond what you could. Yet you got to complete it. You got to follow through on it. Because if you don't follow through on it, then everything that you built up by this spiritual discipline is brought to naught. And so you have to understand that the willingness is there and the gift is acceptable, which is great. But you need to give, and you give according to what you have, not according to what you don't have. Apostle Paul is really kind of putting it there. So, just a few things to kind of follow up here, and kind of, I thought maybe we can get something from the services that kind of reinforce what I've just been talking, or even some of the church fathers. There's lots and lots and lots and lots of stuff. And if you're really interested, again, that book, First and Finest, goes through this in excruciating detail. And it's actually fascinating to read how he put this all together. But let's start with a couple of important things to kind of wrap it up. So on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, so that's the first Sunday after Lent begins, when we celebrate the restoration of the icons in the church, and we have these processions. There's these verses that are sung during the service, that Vesper service. And again, we just entered Great Lent. Come, let us cleanse ourselves by almsgiving and acts of mercy to the poor, not sounding a trumpet or making a show of our charity. Let not our left hand know what our right hand is doing. Let not vainglory scatter the fruit of our almsgiving, but in secret let us call on him who knows all secrets. For God, Father, forgive us our trespasses, for thou lovest mankind. That's the final point. We do it in secret. We don't do it so that people know that we're giving. We don't do it so we get a plaque on the wall, or a special memorial, or a special gift because we gave. We do it in secret because God knows what we're doing. We do it for God. Just like when we say we fast in secret, right? Also, Paul talks about that, or Christ talks about that. You put on oil in your face, etc. We do this giving in secret as well. No one should know what you're doing. There should be no memorial to you. It should be done because that is from the heart, and God knows that. And so, my brothers, that's where we need to kind of focus ourselves in. Another one from St. Isaac of Syria. If you give something to one in need, the cheerfulness of your face precedes the gift and comforts his sorrow with kind words. And when you do this, by your gift, the gladness of your mind surpasses even the needs of his body. In other words, just a smile, love, kindness, and cheerfulness is more important than anything else. That's really what we're talking about, right? Being a Christian. That's how I started off, right? Ultimately, this is about being a Christian and how we should live as a Christian. The mark of a Christian is someone who's joyful and cheerful and kind and hopeful and full of love and willing to suffer on behalf of others and do all the things that we are called to do. And it starts, part of that foundation is how we give and how we treat others around us and how we live that life. And then another one. This is from Abbot Dorotheus. He's in the Philokalia, the sayings of the Desert Fathers, these huge volumes. And he says, no one can say, I am poor, hence I have no means of giving alms. For even if you cannot give as the rich give their gifts into the temple treasury, give 2 farthings as the poor widow did. And from you God will consider it a greater gift than the gift of the rich. And if you do not have as much as 2 farthings, you can take pity on the sick and give alms by ministering to them. And if you cannot even do this, you can comfort your brother by the words. A good word is better than the best of gifts. A good word is better than the best of gifts. So, my dear brothers and sisters, we went through this kind of discussion of what stewardship is. And ultimately, we came back to how we treat one another, how we love God, how we live our life, how we see ourselves in God's creation, how we care for that which God has given us, whether it be the entire world, that little piece of the world that you're standing on, how we look into another person's face and offer them love and kindness and hope and cheer, how we find that Lazarus who's laying at our footstep, and rather like the rich man who was without name, walking around them and ignoring him, but rather caring for that Lazarus that is right before us. How we make sure that what that church that God has entrusted to us is healthy, loving, growing, kind, a beacon, a light to the world, a refuge for those who have no hope, a hospital for those who are sick, a place where we can find brothers and sisters in peace and love and community, where we can unite ourselves to God through his gifts, the Eucharist, and all the sacraments. Whether we as a Christian can endure all those things which may be placed upon us and do it with a cheerful heart. Whether we can be a person who is reflecting and shining with the light of God's love, or a person who can be angry and bitter and ashamed, finding fault in every little thing that we may have. That is not at all what a Christian is. That is why when we talk about about stewardship, we are ultimately talking about who we are as a person and who we are as a people. And that when we look at ourselves honestly and truly, we find in the deepest recesses of our heart that we can be someone who loves God, serves God, and wants God to be in our lives. So, that being said, hope this helps in understanding. Again, just a quick reminder of the things that we need to do. We need to be able to give of our time, our talent, and our treasure. We should give as we should always give, I put my notes, first fruits regularly, freely, joyfully, sacrificially, without expectations of receiving anything in return, and most importantly, do it in secret. And then we should be able to do allow those elements within our life to change us, to change who we are, to change because we and become stronger in our faith, not to lead us away from God, but by being a good steward. We are fulfilling our original purpose, which is to offer to God that which is His. Amen. Everyone have a blessed and peaceful evening. Next week, we're going to talk about the parish and what does it mean. Good night.